You're listening to The Conversation. Looksmaxxing is getting a lot of attention right now.
Male glow-ups have reached new levels with the rise of something called looksmaxxing.
It's called looksmaxxing.
Looksmaxxing.
Have you ever heard of looksmaxxing?
It's even been mocked on Saturday Night Live.
All you gotta do is protein max, steroid max, and meth max, then inshallah.
As some young men in the manosphere go to extreme lengths to change the way they look, the question is, whose standards dictate what is attractive?
Subhuman is the lowest.
Subhuman's like you're not even a human, you're so chopped.
Yep. Then it goes low tier normie,
Low tier normie.
mid tier normie, that's average. High tier normie is above average. Chad light and Chad. That's the rating scale.
This is Clavicular, considered one of the figureheads of the looksmaxxing movement. He's describing the different levels of the PSL scale, a pseudoscientific attractiveness ranking system. If you have teenagers in your life, they'll probably have heard of it, or at least the language associated with it. Chad, Stacy, Normie, Subhuman. But the roots of this PSL scale lie in misogynistic online forums used by incels or involuntary celibates. So how did the language of incels and this one way of quantifying attractiveness and beauty become so mainstream? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, the origins of the pseudoscientific attractiveness ranking that grew out of incel forums and is now making money for looksmaxxing influencers. Jordan Foster, you're an associate professor of sociology at MacEwan University in Alberta, Canada, where you study social media and masculinity. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So explain the PSL scale to me, and because it's set out in like different levels, and I've got a version of it up here. And we should say this is on a website called looksmaxx.org, which has kind of quantified the scale. But tell me what I'm looking at. Tell me how the scale actually works.
Right. Okay. So the PSL scale is basically ranked all the way from 8 at the top end to 0.25 at the bottom of the scale. Now, the scale has accompanying terminology for both men and women. At level 8, or between 7.75 and 8, we see figures like Tara Chad and Tara Stacy. These would be individuals who are incredibly attractive. Most scales will refer to these individuals as having impossible to achieve appearances and specific sort of markers.
What kind of celebrities or people might be able to visualize would get that rating?
I think, for my generation, it would probably be someone like a Brad Pitt or an Angelina Jolie, though not everyone in these looksmaxxing communities may agree with that.
So then if you go beyond that, how does the language change below that?
So below the sort of top of the scale, we have figures like Giga Chad and Giga Stacy. So these are individuals who, again, are quite rare. They epitomize beauty standards. They have an exceptional look about them. Their appearance is more challenging to achieve. Below that, we have figures like Chad and Stacy. So this is someone who's quite attractive, but maybe a little bit more common. And for most of the individuals who are having conversations in looksmaxxing communities, this is actually somewhat more achievable. So individuals who, again, capture or embody very narrow appearance standards, but are incredibly attractive. And that scale would be about 6 to 7.25. Below them, we have a more achievable but still attractive look at 5.5 to 6 Chad light and Stacy light.
Then it becomes quite bad, doesn't it? And pretty derogatory.
It does. It starts to break down looks between basically what we would consider to be normal, high tier normal, mid tier normal, low normal, and then subhuman.
And the word for women for that is a Becky. So a low tier Becky, a mid tier Becky. So that's like the female equivalent of a normie.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's quite derogatory. And this kind of allusion to a very specific person who, upon mentioning them, is immediately kind of denigrated by way of their appearance.
So Jordan, you're a young man who spends a lot of time online. When did you first become aware of the PSL?
My pathway into looksmaxxers, PSL, this vocabulary that's really expansive was in the last 4 years for me. I began studying beauty first among women online and then found that men were doing some very interesting things. So looksmaxxing has moved from these largely sort of incel discussion forums and community threads to mainstream platforms like TikTok and Instagram. We're starting to see people pick up this dialogue, and a lot of young people are very familiar with some of the most significant labels that have bubbled up through the community, and that includes something like Chad and Stacy. Not everyone is aware of where they've come from, but they're more and more aware of what they mean.
Let's talk about where they've come from. Take me back to the origins of the scale. How did it come about, and what does PSL stand for?
PSL is a way of referring essentially to the trifecta of forums involved in the manosphere. So when we're thinking about PSL, we're typically thinking about PUA hate. So this is a forum that discusses pickup artists. These are men who are deploying different kinds of tricks to get women and to be successful in the dating sphere. And the PUA hate group is antagonistic toward this group. There's also this broader forum known as slut hate, and then a forum dedicated toward lookism. Now, together, they're deeply concerned with matters related to look and appearance, and they go about in a kind of pseudoscientific way, distinguishing between the most attractive among us, the least attractive among us, and then different sort of tips and tricks you might deploy to maximize your look and appearance. So the original point of origin for this kind of discussion is largely in these incel community groups and in groups related to that anti-feminist discussion online.
These three forums that you've mentioned that together are collectively referred to as PSL, they're no longer active in their original form. In fact, the PUA hate forum was shut down after it was linked to a man who killed 7 people in Santa Barbara in 2014. And yet the acronym PSL is now attached to this scale. How did that happen?
Yeah, so out of these discussions comes this really precise dialogue around what constitutes attractiveness and beauty, which features specifically are the ones we want to invest in or maximize. And again, it's quite pseudoscientific. So you'll see them pull on very specific features, like, for example, the eyes or the jawline and sometimes the nose. And we're making really fine-grained distinctions that have, some sort of biological illusions. So there might be notions, for example, that a strong brow bone or a stronger jawline is going to communicate a certain amount of testosterone, that this is going to suggest something about your virility or your fitness. The scale is used differently by different members of these discussion forums, threads, and community groups online. We would typically think about some of those members in terms of these distinctions like black pill, red pill, and blue pill. That distinction harkens back to the Matrix and to scenes within the film where we're taking this pill that makes us more alive or alert to reality, so to speak.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
So the blue pill is essentially to accept the status quo. But if you've taken the red pill, then you have become alive to the fact that we live in a world that often talks about things like gender inequality. But for these gentlemen, there is a belief that, in fact, we have this all wrong and we've been tricked. It's not that women are disadvantaged. In fact, it's that men are disadvantaged. And taking the red pill would make us more alive to this trick, right? And black pill is thinking, no amount of augmentation or intervention can really assist you. So for members of the black pill community, there's a lot of rejection of self-improvement. There is a kind of resignation toward your biological capacity. We are born with these biologically determined pathways that will amount to success for some and to failure in things like dating and relationships for others. Now, that's not a feeling that all men in the manosphere share. So there are members of the manosphere who would say instead, well, you can do things to move beyond your biological capacity. So that's a slightly different bent on how we use this scale. Now we're thinking about the tricks we could deploy to amplify or enhance your appearance and move you up along the scale.
So the scale kind of emerged from these involuntary celibate, more black belt communities. How did it then move beyond that to other parts of the manosphere?
The movement of some of these terms and the scale specifically from these more fringe community spaces to the mainstream is not a straightforward pivot or adoption. It's actually shaped by a constellation of factors, including that independent of these communities, there are pressures upon men to beautify and enhance their appearance. So we see the adoption of this scale and some of that language largely by influencers and everyday users on social media platforms that we recognize as more mainstream. They adopt and pull from some of that language. They then communicate that to a broader public, and they debate the merits of some of these tricks that we might deploy to amplify or enhance our appearance. With time, this becomes a sort of more mainstream conversation that's now divorced from its point of origin.
How have some of those incel communities online who kind of created this scale reacted to looksmaxxing becoming more normalized and seeping in, or at least its language seeping into mainstream culture?
So the Black pill community is quite critical of the mainstreaming of looksmaxxing and practices more generally that are designed to enhance your appearance. And remember, this is a group that has a lot of fatalistic attitudes toward the state of culture and toward the state of gender affairs. They tend to be quite anti-woman. They believe that they exist in a culture that is anti-man, and that femininity has advanced in ways that ultimately disadvantage men and that make any kind of potential for close relationships or sexual conquest nearly impossible. So they tend to consider looksmaxxing and these recommendations as superficial and frankly stupid, right? Why would you do this? There's no real opportunity here. And they tend to be quite frustrated at men who they feel possess the right qualities, so to speak, genetically, right? That they're born sort of gifted. And they often will critique even some of the language that they help to propel. So Chad, for example, is this necessarily superficial and ridiculous male who women like, but that's ridiculous too, right? So I would say that they would not view this mainstreaming of this language as a positive turn. If anything, I think they'd be quite critical of that.
Some of this terminology, that the fact that you could put yourself on a scale, it seems ridiculously intricate and like mapped out very kind of precisely. What does it purport to measure?
Most of the individuals in this community think about looks as something that are objective, scientific, and biologically determined. That's very different from understanding our looks as socially and historically situated, which is how most social scholars think about beauty, as being somewhat more subjective and something that actually changes over time. So the scale purports to measure human attractiveness, which it recognizes exists, along a spectrum in the population. Now, the qualities that would be highly relevant would be something like facial symmetry or facial harmony. So we want to look, for example, for high cheekbones. We want to look for a stronger jaw if we're thinking about men. We're also thinking about our eyes and things like to what degree do they tilt, right? And how sharp is the gaze? And there are some gentlemen online too who will move the scale to think more broadly about the body as well. So in men's case, that's going to be a more muscular body, right? As opposed to a lanky appearance. Height also matters very much, especially for men. Whereas for women, you can imagine we're thinking about certain kinds of curves. We're thinking about fullness in the right places and thinness in others, more soft and delicate features. Whereas for men, sharper features. Now, the scale suggests for men an inroad to maximize or enhance their appearance, and in so doing, move themselves along the scale upward toward, like, for example, Chad or Chad Light. Now, out of that, the logic goes, you will have more success in the marriage market. You'll have more sexual success. You'll have success in dating. So these men are really thinking about how can I maximize my appearance to experience more success among women. I think too, more broadly, and this is something I find quite fascinating about what the scale could be used for, it gives men a sense of control over a space, a social space they feel they've lost a lot of control in. So for men who perhaps feel helpless in the dating market, for example, or who have very limited success sexually speaking, this gives them something tangible and measurable to really tap into, to seize, and then to work on, right? And that sense of control, I think, is a very, very potent and appetizing sedative.
You say that these ideas have been taken up by some members of the manosphere who argue that men can actually improve their score in some way on this scale. What kind of techniques are being advocated as a way to make yourself go up the scale?
Some of the practices that we've heard about are things like bone smashing. This is the practice of taking something like a hammer or a strong object to usually the jaw. The idea is that you're going to break or fracture the bone and that it will grow back more forcefully, stronger, enhancing the width of the jawline, right? And it's going to appear stronger.
But it must be quite a rare thing to do.
Oh, yes. So bone smashing is definitely not the most popular of the practices men could entertain, but it's received a lot of attention in part because of how dangerous it is and because of how sort of, fringe and out there this practice is. And to their credit, there are figures in the sort of looksmaxxing community who would not endorse this practice. Another practice that's more common and not necessarily dangerous would be mewing. That's the practice of bringing your tongue to the roof of your mouth. The idea is that this is going to produce a more sort of slender neck. It's going to bring any sort of, I'll say, wobble under your chin upward. And this is going to help to, again, give you that more sort of sharp jawline and this elongated neck. More common practices that are mundane and everyday would be something like having a rigorous diet or fitness routine, which increasingly is now under the umbrella of gym maxing. Even having a skincare regime or entertaining cosmetic surgery could fall within looks maxing. So there's now, for example, the popularization of the term surgery maxing for men who are willing to entertain cosmetic or plastic surgery to achieve this look.
Wow. And people really believe by doing these practices that they will climb up the scale in some way? Or is there an element of kind of a joke in this? I mean, it seems so pseudoscientific.
Well, some men online have debunked certain of the practices, and they actually will tell other gentlemen online which of these is most likely to lead to success and which are not. So you can search, for example, on YouTube and Instagram, gentlemen who are basically ranking which of the practices are best, and they assign those also to a tier system, perhaps unsurprisingly, and then endorse, certain practices over others. The question of a joke, though, is interesting because some of these pressures, I should say many of these pressures have existed for women for a very long time. And women have endorsed and entertained some similarly bizarre practices, which is not a critique of femininity or women, but you can imagine, for example, the popularization of diet teas, right? That were supposed to produce a remarkable transformation of the body. And of course, they don't do that, right? This is somewhat more novel for men. And we might think of it as silly or superficial, but in that case, I would say, well, turn your gaze toward the things women have entertained historically or been told would work for them. It's not wrong per se to endorse some of these because beauty is socially powerful and it can feel very rewarding to achieve it. Right? And that's something that men are experiencing. And I think, again, that's a very powerful incentive. If you look at YouTube, Instagram, TikTok platforms where this conversation is more mainstream, you can see men who discuss their transformation, their looks maxing journey. So it's not just that they've now, got this boost in confidence and self-esteem. They're getting more friendships. They're getting more success in the dating and marriage market.
Well, they say they are.
Yes, they say they are. Sidebar, the literature on appearance and attractiveness suggests that the more of it you have and the more attractive you are perceived, the more rewards flow your way. And so it's not an illogical or irrational assumption that if we work on our appearance, more things, more social rewards, economic rewards, more success in dating and marriage will come our way.
What do you see, though, are the problems with the fact that some people think there is a scientific ideal? I'm thinking here about the fact that that ideal is essentially a white man.
Yeah.
So where are the problems inherent in that one vision of what beautiful is?
Beauty is not just one thing, but the beauty ideal as it's been understood in this PSL scale tends to operationalize a beauty ideal that is white by default, that is incredibly muscular if we're talking about men, and that is also classed. And that's lost in a lot of the discussion on this scale What we're asking most men to achieve is this look that is racialized, that is more easily achieved by those who have light skin or who are white, by those who are taller, which we have very little genetic control over, by those who are upper class. And why would that be? Well, because to achieve the look, it would require leisure time and significant economic investment in the face and body, right? And that's not something everyone can achieve. I think women understand this very well, but this is a new conversation for men. But a lot of that is lost on them.
Where did this idea that beauty can be quantifiable come from? That there's like a scientifically ideal type of beauty that can be measured in this way?
I think that that is a result of men coming to terms with a topic that has historically been taboo and historically been feminized. So if we want to have a discussion around beauty, which is essentially what we're doing, we need to figure out a way to communicate that discussion in a language that is traditionally more palatable for men. How do you do that? Wrap it in the guise of science, right? Discuss beauty as something that's quantifiable and manageable, and that has this scientific evidence underscoring it. There is a parallel conversation taking place for women, though. So in the cosmetic market for women, we're seeing more often than not everyday cosmetics like moisturizers being marketed in ways that borrow from the language of science and from more intensive surgical intervention.
Coming up, how looksmaxxing influencers are using the PSL scale to make money. That's after this short break. If you're enjoying the Conversation Weekly, you may also enjoy a podcast from our friends at the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK. They're currently celebrating the release of the 10th series of one of the UK's most popular social science podcasts, The We Society with Will Hutton. Whether it's Richard Wiseman exploring the science of luck, Stefanie Hatch sharing healthcare stories, or Jan-Emmanuel Denève on the World Happiness Report, the We Society with Will Hutton is the place to hear how social science research insights can inspire optimism, connection, and positive change. That's the We Society with Will Hutton, available on Spotify, Apple, and all major podcast platforms. So, Jordan, we've been talking about the language around this pseudoscientific looksmaxxing scale, PSL scale, and the way it's been used online. But how are people actually making money from it?
There are a number of individuals who have become widely followed as a result of their intervention in this space. There are influencers, for example, micro-celebrities, podcasters, who weigh in on these conversations and suggest to men and young boys what they might do to produce a more attractive appearance. And you'll often find that alongside their suggestions are products of their own that they endorse and suggest will assist in this. So a popular YouTuber in this space, Brett Maverick, for example, introduced a gum that would help to strengthen your jaw as it's chewed.
That's why I recommend chewing the toughest chewing gum in the world, Brett's Jawline Gum. Yes, this is my product, and yes, I'm promoting it because I know it's a damn good product. This is 10 times tougher than normal chewing gum, and it will make your jaw grow wider. Link is in the bio.
So if we're on YouTube, for example, and we have a lot of subscribers listening in as we talk about this PSL scale or different kinds of looksmaxxing practices in our recommendations, well, we're making money just from having that conversation through things like built-in advertising, right? From the views, likes, clicks, and engagement with that video. So these are ways for men to generate an income, right? From profiting from some of those anxieties.
And what about ways that you can assess your own position on the scale?
Right. So there has been a rise in applications that will help to determine where you might fall on the scale, but there's also a rise in men ranking one another. So you can turn to the forums themselves and ask other men online to assess your appearance, to provide a ranking. That I think is really interesting, that men are turning to one another to be evaluators of their appearance instead of turning to women, which is an option, right? This is another instance, though, where there are parallels for women. A lot of young women can also turn to social media applications to have their appearance assessed or ranked, oftentimes anonymously, and then to improve their appearance or perhaps to experience a boost in their confidence, depending on the assessment.
Why do you think young men have latched onto beauty as a way through the world in the 21st century and this online space that they're occupying?
I think the answer lies in a much bigger set of changes. Those changes are economic, they're social, and they're cultural. So what we've seen in the last decade or so is that men are they're losing ground in social and economic and even political spheres where they once dominated. Things like, for example, occupational categories in manufacturing and resource extraction, even education, right? This is a social space once dominated by men, and today women outpace men in almost every level of education. And there are different figures, speaking to men right now who provide antidotes and recommendations. How do we restore masculinity? Masculinity is in crisis. Now, beauty offers one mechanism through which men can grapple with those broad set of changes. And it's within your control. For a lot of these men, it is in things like the dating market, in marriage opportunities, in opportunities for sexual conquest, an area where a lot of men feel frustration and where, again, they feel they may have lost some ground. But you can also leverage these appearance and attractiveness tips and tricks to potentially succeed in the workplace, to get through a labor market interview, for example. So then men turn to other men on platforms like YouTube and Instagram for recommendations. How do I seize on my genetic potential or potentially surpass it? But a lot of these young men are turning to voices that provide a kind of strange, antidote to the problem, right? And there are people who have pointed this out, that we could instead advise young men on, your future girlfriend might really like you to be responsive to her likes and interests, right? And maybe there's some coaching we could have around that. How do you exercise empathy in the context of a relationship? Instead, what we're offering young men is, well, you just need to work out, diet rigorously, mew, so elongate your neck, and these kinds of superficial recommendations to enhance their potential.
What would you say to young men who are seeing these posts online and tempted to try a looksmaxxing app or to try mewing or even rate others on the PSL scale? What would you say to them?
I would say it's not wrong to want to work on your appearance or to invest in beauty. Beauty is a space that can feel rewarding and empowering, and you may find some confidence at the other side of your investment. I would say exercise caution when you're reviewing some of these claims and practices. Double check why an endorsement might be being made and whether or not the figure you're listening to has a sort of vested interest in you following along with that. Because it's not exclusively down to what you look like. And I think that many women would probably tell you so, right? If they were thinking about attractiveness and appearance, I don't think they're squarely interested in how wide your jawline is, but instead maybe what you have to say, how you think, and how you might treat someone. So I would think really holistically about how to amplify your confidence, understanding that it's not wrong to, think about beauty or attractiveness and maybe want to make some investments in that space, but be really mindful as you do that.
Thank you so much, Jordan. A fascinating delve into this online space. Thank you very much.
Of course.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more about looksmaxxing and the manosphere on The Conversation, and we'll put some links in our show notes to further reading. Special thanks for this episode go to Martin Risius and Christopher David at New Ulm University in Germany, who recently published an analysis of looksmaxxing apps on The Conversation. This episode was written and produced by Katie Flood and me, Gemma Ware, and I'm also the show's executive producer. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you value what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please? A piece of sea perch and 8 whiting fillets, please, Pauline.
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland.
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
To the heart of Australian politics. This is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out.
Gone. I don't like it. No, I don't. Never did.
Now, no one's laughing.
One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation.
The fringe becomes the mainstream.
This is the story of how a party built on fear and grievance thrived, died, and rose again to upend Australian politics.
Well, I'm back.
Hanson 2.0 is the serious, strategic, experienced, battle-hardened political operator that we see in the news today.
I'm Ashlyn McGee. This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.